All right, guys, we're back with the story of the African struggles for independence after World War II. We've talked about Asia, we've talked about Latin America, we've talked about America, United States, Europe, and so forth. And Africa will be the last place that we really try and tell the story of what's going on. And really, the key where we want to focus here on is decolonization. All right, the removal of the status of these African colonies into what we call a diverse group of independent states. Okay, this happens very, very quickly, just like with India. All right, and it's really messy. And really, most African nations are still struggling with how to figure this out. How how do leaders come to power as soon as we have this vacuum when Europeans leave, and actually run a state that's somewhat effective at providing infrastructure, economic security, political security, etc. And really, Africa still to this day has not done a great job in wrestling with that prospect. So, how is this happening? Well, the first thing is that Europeans lose their will to hold on to their empires. World War II is basically a fight to make sure that evil empires, right, like the Nazi system, is broken up. All right, even Mussolini, for instance, his empire was actually seen as a bigger threat than Germany's in the 1930s when he invaded Italy. So, most of the fighting is done to get rid of empire building, and so after World War II, these powers in Europe, like Britain, France, etc., have to deal with, well, we just fought a war to get rid of empires, and we actually did it using our colonial population. And so can we really ask them to go back and just be subservient again? And the answer is no. And so all these new nationalist leaders in these areas, including Africa, put pressure on the British government, French government, other European powers, Portugal for instance, to let them go, let them have their own path, okay? And Europe will do it. They'll do it very quickly, and probably too quickly for Africa, and it leaves kind of a jagged edge of sorts. Unification is going to be very difficult. Ethnic, religious, and linguistic differences are going to occur in these areas. I show this map to you again. We looked at it earlier this year. This is a tribal map of Africa with the new borders superimposed over it. And notice how some of the tribes are split into different countries. Here's a tribe right here in the Sahara. I don't know which one it is, but some of it is in this country, all right, Mauritania, and some of it is over here in Chad, right? So they get split right apart. This will also happen over here between Tanzania and Kenya. Or on the other hand, we'll actually see areas like Rwanda right here where warring tribes, all right, will be thrown into one country, okay? And what we get is civil war. A lot of civil war, a lot of fighting trying to deal with who should lead the country and how power will be shared. Different populations, known as heterogeneous populations, mixtures of different groups will try to deal with these unification, okay? Africa will also have to deal with problems of modernization and rapid industrialization. Africa is still undergoing their industrial revolution now as they kind of build and continue to build infrastructure. But Africa needs to wrestle with these issues. How are they going to fund the construction of electrical grids? How are they going to provide communications networks, right? All of these issues, as well as urbanization and contact with Western technology and culture, will be big issues for these areas to develop, especially urbanization, because the cities simply just do not have the capability to support the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that are flocking to major city centers. Those who are actually pushing the nationalist movement are coming from a variety of groups, including lawyers and doctors and teachers, urban workers, peasant farmers, and other professional classes. So it's a pretty widespread group of people from all segments of society. This is not like the Chinese Communist Party, where Mao is basically finding support from the lower class groups, like peasant farmers, for instance, and creating a revolution. Nationalist movements in Africa will align with the middling and the lower classes, kind of similar to India, okay? You would think that this would actually stabilize their group, but it doesn't, and we'll talk about why that happens. The big thing to keep in mind is that by 1963, so by the time that JFK is shot, 2/3 of Africa is independent. And that's only 6 years after the first nation, Ghana, will become independent. So very quickly, right? In 6 years, 2/3 of the entire continent will be independent. This, of course, does not occur um, in the southern part, okay? White minorities underneath the Congo. Here's the Congo right here, which will be renamed Zaire. These areas will remain controlled by white minorities. So Zambia right here, Zimbabwe, Botswana, of course, South Africa with the system of apartheid, Namibia. These areas will struggle to get true black leadership that stays. Maybe besides Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has Robert Mugabe that's in power. Okay, but anyway, they'll struggle in the southern. Whites, the vast minority, will hold on to power there. Okay, so the very first nation that's going to receive its independence is Ghana, right? And Ghana is right here on the map, right there. All right, and Ghana is led by a guy by the name of Kwame Nkrumah. Let me get a picture of this guy, that way you can see it. Kwame Nkrumah. I always want to put an H there, but there's no H there. There you go. There he is right there. Okay, so he is the leader in Ghana. Ghana is a British colony, and he is going to be pushing for independence as soon as 1949. He calls for self-government now, okay? It takes 8 years for Kwame Nkrumah to actually get on board with the British colonial empire, but finally they agree to oversee independence for Ghana, and Ghana will receive it in 1957. Kwame Nkrumah is also the leader of the first Pan-African movement, which was an alliance of all African nations for independence. That's what it initially was for. Since then, it's become a movement for, common economic and political development. Okay, but Kwame Nkrumah was really looking initially at getting all of these countries in Africa independent from their colonial empires, regardless if they were British colonies or not. Now, the British are willing to give Ghana and also Nigeria independence during this era for a number of reasons. First, there aren't many white people there, okay? So there's not a lot of white settlers that will have to leave the country or give up land back to black leadership when it transitions, okay? So it's not going to affect that many, we call expats or expatriated British citizens. Secondly, the British were hopeful that the people who are in charge, the civil elite, right, will keep their economic and political ties with the United Kingdom. So they're basically looking at the American model and saying, hey, America doesn't colonize the areas it controls economically, i.e. Latin America. Why don't we follow that model, keep supporting leaders who will benefit us advantageously in trade and politics, and we'll make sure that we more or less stay in control from that arena, which is a pretty good idea. They, of course, will not do that, which we'll talk about later. Nkrumah, though, takes over. It's kind of a failed experiment. They rewrite the Constitution, which is very, very authoritarian. And Ghana will end up having a host of problems later, including corruption and economic problems, smuggling issues, which will eventually lead to his overthrow in 1966. Okay, and this will be the common script of leaders in Africa, with a few exceptions. All right. In Nigeria, okay, so the second British colony to receive its independence, Nigeria has to deal with religious and ethnic descent. There are three main ethnic groups in there, and the country is split. This is Nigeria, by the way, into a Muslim north and a Christian south. Nigeria also has a lot of tribes, very densely populated area. And what happens is the Igbos, the leading tribe in the south, calls for a secession, all right? So Nigeria to be basically split in half, with the new area being called Biafra, okay? This leads to basically a civil war, all right, that rages for about 3 years, all right? The Igbos basically do not get independence, okay? And it shows this massive, massive disaster where thousands and thousands die for no apparent reason, right? And you would think, well, it's a pretty good idea maybe to just split up these groups. Like, why not partition, right? Why not partition Nigeria and just have the Muslims stay up here and the Christians stayed on here. Well, we've already found out how partition works very poorly, right? I mean, look at the India partition, right? Look at, I mean, so many millions of people, ended up being displaced. Hundreds of thousands of people died, right? So partition is not the answer, and so not only Nigeria, but many African nations have to basically just stay together, like I say here, in one boundary, right? Instead of trying to fight for new ones. So it makes sense that they just don't fight. They try and work their problems out. Although, as we'll also see, it's not very effective. Okay. In other areas, in the Congo, we'll have a new leader in Patrice Lumumba. All right, he wants the UN to intervene. What's going on there is there's another leader, all right, Moise Tshambe, who is looking to split a province known as Katanga. Let me pull this up right here, the Katanga province. He's looking to split it off from the rest of the Congo, all right? And there it is. It's the southeast kind of sector here. Let me pull up a bigger picture. And this is really where the minerals are, right? There's a lot of mining that goes on in the Congo. You might be thinking, oh, well, this is mostly a rainforest area. It is very heavily rainforested, but as you can see here, right here's a mining picture. All right, not all of it's rainforest. So this whole area, Katanga, is going to be split off, or at least attemptedly split off. Tshambe has got alliances with a lot of U.S. and European-backed companies that own the companies that are actually extracting the minerals. And Lumumba isn't cool with it, okay? He really tries to unify the country as much as possible. He dabbles in communism, although he's not a full-fledged communist. He does look to the Soviet Union for potential mediation here. And as a result, he is assassinated in 1961 with the aid of the CIA, okay? Mobutu, Joseph Mobutu, a general, will take over. He changes the name of the Congo to Zaire. And Mobutu is actually known, he liked to wear these pretty awesome leopard skin caps. There you go. That's kind of his shtick right there. But Mobutu, he was an absolutely horrible leader. All right, this guy was corrupt. He ruled the Congo basically as a private feudal estate. He basically siphoned off enormous amounts of funds for his own private gain, and actually lived most of the time in Europe, which is pretty nuts. So disaster in the Congo, and really today is still recovering. All right. Another thing I want to mention real quick is what happens in French West Africa. Remember, the French are mostly in this area in the West. All right, France is another one of the Allied powers that wins, but is being pressured to let go of their empires. All right, in areas like the Ivory Coast, Senegal, etc. And what happens there is that we actually get a bunch of military dictatorships. The reason why is there's still this kind of respect of the, quote, big man mentality, right? So when we have military leaders like generals and colonels, right, they seem like big men, strong leaders that take over. Well, the idea is every single one seems to think themselves equipped to take over a country, right? So even though they can put down tribal disputes, they basically abuse that power. It comes at a high price. What we get is a lot of military states in French West Africa that really, don't allow democracy to flourish whatsoever. Curiously, though, these French colonies do keep close economic and cultural ties with France, and that's one major difference between the British and the French colonies. Most British colonies do not. They go their own ways and establish ties with other nations. They kind of forge ahead and do their own thing. So this kind of backfired. Remember the second reason that Britain was willing to give independence to Ghana and Nigeria is they thought they would keep ties. Well, they don't. So see ya. Also, to remind you, the U.S. is very involved in overthrowing Lumumba. We mentioned how the CIA helps assassinate Lumumba in '61, and then they actually form the coup that puts Mobutu in power. So we actually put this incredibly corrupt, quote, anti-communist in power, right? We basically think, oh, well, if he's against communists, then he'll be a great leader, and that's crap, as we already know from Latin America. These guys we support are dictators that restrict personal freedoms and human rights in the meantime benefit enormously. Okay. Next area we'll check out is Kenya. Kenya is interesting in the fact that it has a ton of white settlers that actually had more or less stolen land from different tribes, including the Kikuyu tribe. And when they also pushed for independence during the late 50s, early 60s, led by a guy named Jomo Kenyatta. He leads the fight to free Kenya, right? He does not think that it's okay that whites' salaries and living standards are increasing while blacks do not. Okay, and he had actually arrested as part of, or at least he's allegedly conspiring with the Kikuyus, also known as the Mau Maus, that basically are seen as terrorists who are fighting against Africans who are collaborating with whites, right? So it's a civil war, I guess, of sorts that goes down. The war lasts from 1952 to 56. Kenyatta is actually imprisoned during this time, but after being released, will help lead Kenya. And what's interesting about Kenya is, of all the colonies, right? And even though it was a single party state, leadership actually worked there. Kenya's relatively prosperous. The whites that do remain in Kenya have equal rights. They can share resources fairly effectively. And even when he dies, the transition of power is actually fairly smooth. So there's actually a success story in Kenya. They're still considered a third world country, but have dealt with some of the problems of decolonization in Africa at least decently well. Next area we'll talk about is South Africa and Rhodesia. Rhodesia is this area, so that includes, hold on, we actually get an old map. Named after Cecil Rhodes, by the way, explorer. Rhodesia includes the modern-day states of Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Zambia. Okay, so let me see. Rhodesia. We can't find an old map. Here's an old map. There we go. So Rhodesia would be more or less in this area. Okay. Rhodesia, of course, is going to be one of those areas where Southern whites or Southern African whites would try and hold on to power. In Zimbabwe, for instance, basically what happens is a guy named Ian Smith tries to declare independence in 1965 and says, listen, we're going to create our own state and it's going to be white-led and, screw you, world community. Nobody accepts it except for South Africa, and basically it is overthrown in short order. In South Africa, this is where we see a system of apartheid. It's not shocking that they would actually support Ian Smith in his declaration of a white-controlled state. The Afrikaners, the kind of the Dutch, hybrid Dutch, British population, actually had openly favored the Nazis. They used a very strict racial segregation policy known as apartheid to keep blacks, colored people who are mixed race descent, and actually Indians, Asians, separate from each other, right? So 4.5 million whites will end up ruling over 25 million minorities by 1980. Okay, and this is a pretty brutal system. Somebody asked me once if I thought that Southern segregation was worse than apartheid, and as bad as Southern segregation was, I think apartheid would take the cake on this one. Apartheid required blacks in South Africa to carry permits everywhere they went. They had to leave white parts of town at night. They were herded into these private black communities and really black reservations known as Bantustans, right, where the conditions were basically abysmal. It was the worst territory, horrible infrastructure, horrible sanitary conditions, right? Actually, only 13% of all the land in South Africa. This is where you kind of had to go to get out of the way of the white-owned majority. So it was pretty bad. There's, of course, the racial segregation in America is pretty bad, but we're not requiring our black populace to carry around permit books and leave cities in the middle of the night. The body that's fighting against apartheid is known as the African National Congress, okay, initially led by Albert Luthuli's leadership, and then will be taken up by Mandela in the 60s. And Mandela rises to power during this episode known as the Sharpeville Massacre, and I'll show you a video on this in class. This is 1960 when a group of black South Africans were protesting, and basically what happened, the police opened fire on a crowd, killed 69 people, and it really was like a massacre. People were being shot as they were running away, shot in the back. It was pretty terrible, and it showed kind of the broken system in the world community that South Africa has got it backwards. And actually, if anything, helped fuel the civil rights movement in America, right? And it helped, especially Martin Luther King Jr. show, understand that if you wanted to change people's hearts and minds, potentially you just show the brutality that's going on, right? And that's how you can actually succeed with peaceful protest. Like I said, it leads to the rise of Mandela. He is the head of the ANC, more or less, after that. He'll be hunted down for about 3 years after this, jailed, and isn't released until 1990, okay? But he's kind of the symbol of the end of racial segregation in South Africa and really beyond. He'll actually become the president of South Africa in due time. Last thing we want to talk about is the role of black South Africans in apartheid. They try to resist and fight discrimination when possible, but they're really a servile class to whites, right? To maintain their privilege in the economy and in politics. Okay, as I mentioned before, they could only enter white parts of town with permits and had to leave before it got dark. So, that of course is over now, but this is a modern day picture actually. South African slums are still quite bad. There's not been a massive transition of economic power, at least down to the black segments of society. So even though apartheid is officially over, it's slow to change, right? And this is where we talk about white privilege. Of course, if you're white in South Africa, you have access to usually a lot more money and upward mobility than if you're born a poor black, although that system is changing, albeit slowly. And last term I'll mention here is the Bandung Conference in 1955. It's kind of out of context, but we want to keep this in mind. It's part of the Pan-Africa movement, but this conference is seeking to unify Africa and Asia as well, right? So developing countries are getting together in the 50s and 60s as they are decolonized and start to place an emphasis on developing with each other's aid instead of looking at their old European counterparts for help. All right, that is it. I'll leave you with this little map of the different Bantustans, okay, around South Africa. All right, and notice how they're not necessarily by big cities, right? So big cities like Cape Town, for instance, Johannesburg, Pretoria, right? They're kind of really in areas that are away from major city centers, right? So out of sight, out of mind, similar to Native American reservations when those are built in the late 19th century in America. Well, mid to late 19th century. All right, good luck with your questions, and let me know if you need any help. Thanks.